wonderful to see so many people here this morning as well. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Mette, for joining us. We're very fortunate today to have this talk about the value of literature for consciousness research given by Mette Høeg, who is currently a research fellow at Oxford University, and Mette is conducting a really exciting project that's funded by the Carlsberg Foundation on the role of literature and the humanities in the development of a consciousness culture and ethics. And I think Mette's work, as you'll probably also realize when we say goodbye today, is a really pioneering and interdisciplinary approach to consciousness research, which is quite extraordinary. So please, Mette.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me here today. I was told I was free to structure the talk as I would like to. So the way I've done it is made it sort of somewhere in between a work in progress and an actual talk, aiming for something like 35 minutes speaking, and then hoping for lots of feedback and ideas, because it's very much still work in progress and things that I'm developing. So very curious to hear inputs and criticisms and whatever thoughts may come to your minds. All right. Neurocentrism is on the rise, and with it the explanation of the self as a biological function and a process. A new conception of what it means to be human is emerging, along with new and increased possibilities of influencing and changing brain and mind states. Consciousness and its content are becoming increasingly technologically accessible, and from the new possibilities of influencing and manipulating mental states of humans follow new pressing moral questions and uncertainties. At the same time, new data and theories on the sources of consciousness are spreading from consciousness research and related new disciplines into other research fields. The discovery of the neural correlates of consciousness, the predictive processing theory of brain function, panpsychism, brain-computer interfaces, collective minds technologies and other neurotechnologies for human and cognitive enhancement, the concepts of trance and posthumanism, and the new possibilities of bio and psychedelic human enhancement. These theories obviously come from very different domains and do not form part of any unified neuroscientific position or paradigm. But they have in common that they bring with them challenges to conventional ideas of self, personal identity, agency and moral responsibility, that is, to fundamental ideas that guide our everyday behavior and conversations, and on which some of the most established beliefs about meaning, freedom, responsibility, right, wrong, human moral status, guilt and punishment, and accordingly many of the concrete laws and structures of societies are founded. They open up to distinct possibilities of change, and they produce novel forms of uncertainty, and at the same time confront us with the most fundamental existential questions with a new clarity and urgency. This new neuroanthropology, as Thomas Metzinger has called it, is already being absorbed by the wider society and influencing public imagination and discourse. The wave of interest in trance and posthumanism, AI and neurotechnology in popular culture, the rise of new Buddhism and new Stoicism, and the renaissance of psychedelic research in the West in the last decades indicate that common beliefs about what constitutes a human being are undergoing a change, and that this change involves a shift towards a view that aligns with anti-anthropocentric and reductionist theories of consciousness and self in neuroscience. These new explanations entail an emancipatory potential connected to the realization of the illusion of free will and agency, as well as a potential for mental disturbance, ontological shock, neuroscientific disenchantment, and existential resignation and despair. So there's an interesting tension there that I'm quite interested in. To respond adequately to the challenges and potential disruptions of the scientific explanations, that is, to minimize the disruptive impact on individuals and societies and to exploit their beneficial potential, the natural sciences and humanities should, I argue, collaboratively and proactively engage in the handling of the emerging neuroanthropology. The need for developing consciousness research as a field that takes into consideration the possible psychological and socio-cultural disruption caused by the cultural implementation of this new neuroscientific anthropology has been persuasively argued by Thomas Metzinger. He points to both the seemingly insurmountable obstacles and the absolute necessity of developing a normative theory of consciousness. Many people have long been seeking a convincing theory about what good and desirable states of consciousness actually are, but it's far from clear if searching for such a theory is even a coherent goal. Does it really make sense to speak of a good state of consciousness? A general ethics for conscious experience would inevitably have to face all the foundational issues concerning the epistemic status and the universalizability of ethical norms, which any moral philosophy has to confront. Personally, I tend to be rather skeptical with regard to the prospects of such an ethics for consciousness. However, decisions will have to be made, and it's interesting to note how large the scope of normative consideration in this realm would be. They would range from pedagogics to the euthanasia, from animal rights to robotics, and from drug policy to media policy. My aim with my project and my work is partly as a response to this call from Metzinger for the development of a consciousness, culture and ethics, as he calls it, is to identify the role of the humanities beyond philosophy, and in particular literary studies and literary theory, in filling the normative and existential vacuum that is appearing with the new neuroanthropology and the new possibilities of technologically and biomedically altering consciousness. 3 claims about the value of literature in the context of the ethics of consciousness research and neurotechnology are particularly central here into my project. Contrary to the common view that reductionist and materialist explanations of the human being and existence are anti-humanist, I argue that these are in fact compatible with and even integrated in the humanist ideas of existential emancipation and ethics in much literature from the modernist period. In a number of seminal literary works from this period, the concepts of self and personal identity outlined and explored cohere with the reductionist account of consciousness in philosophy and contemporary neuroscience. Indeed, anti-essentialism may even be seen as a central characteristic of literary modernism. Literature and fictional narrative constitute a valuable resource for conceptual engineering in the neurocentric age. There's a literary philosophical field with its own consciousness research and its own consciousness theory, which offers ideas of self and consciousness that are compatible with modern science and at the same time existentially viable. Literature can be instructive in the discussion of what constitutes desirable states of consciousness, and used to develop models of self that cohere with the reductionist explanations of human consciousness in modern empirical consciousness research. Works such as Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities and Virginia Woolf's The Waves, which I'll use later in this presentation, illustrate the potential for enhancement of human well-being and morality inherent in the anti-essentialist view of human nature and existence. And the philosophical concepts formulated within the narrative and aesthetic frameworks of such novels can be used to formulate ethical and existential models that are both meaningful and sustainable in a cultural and scientific context where reality and human existence are increasingly explained neuroscientifically. Literature holds a potential for offering consolation to persons in the face of the neuroscientific disenchantment and anti-anthropocentrism, that is, for having psychological traction and emotional effect in relation to communication of materialist and physicalist insights and explanations of the human being. With its distinctive narrative, aesthetic and affective dimensions, literature has a capacity to change perspectives and attitudes that is beyond the scope of conventional scientific and philosophical writing. Literature offers ways of relating experientially and emotionally to materialist explanations of human nature and existence that can seem disturbing and alienating when presented in non-fictional genres and through rational and scientific argument. Literature has a special facility to install a sense of meaning, fascination and appreciation into existence, to stimulate curiosity and interest, and as such to work against the existential disenchantment and psychological disruption of new scientific paradigms and scientific materialism. Literature can bring about a move from concept to practice, from idea to experience, as it were, and as such it holds a potential for bridging the divide, or at least the perceived divide, between theoretical rational insight and psychological emotional states in individuals. To sum this up, what I'm looking into the possibility of reconciling and creating a relation of mutual support between humanistic or culturalist views and reductionist and scientific materialism. On to the waves. So there's a strand in literature that links self-transgression and states of selflessness to increased well-being and existential emancipation, as well as to enhancement of morality. The ideas formulated by some of the most prominent writers and thinkers of the last centuries can be viewed as making up this field of literary philosophical theory of mind. This field would include theories and works by Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Sloterdijk, Tolstoy, Sebald, Kafka, Proust, Musil, Rilke, Woolf, Joyce, and also more recently, Siri Hustvedt, Edward St. Aubin, Otessa Moshfegh, Ian McEwan, Ted Chiang, and others. These writers share a strong general interest in theory of mind, epistemology, phenomenology, and subjectivity, and they specifically connect self-transgression and anti-anthropocentric perspectives with the question of existential meaning, well-being, and the future. Virginia Woolf's writing is exemplary of this tendency, as well as of the general tendency in modernist literature to deliberately integrate ideas from the field of science into literature. And I'll use her work, The Waves, as my hopefully illustrative example here. Woolf drew from contemporary sources epistemological lessons related to in particular relativity, wave-particle duality, and the interdependency of observer and observed phenomena. These theories of uncertainty and undecidability of physical phenomena and epistemology from the scientific field aligned with the notions of undecidability and fluidity of identity and consciousness that Woolf herself had already developed. And Woolf used them in her writing to extend her experiments with narrative structure and representation of consciousness and identity. The Waves conveys a non-anthropocentric and non-essentialist conception of self, consciousness and identity, which largely coheres with reductive theories in neuroscience and philosophy, but which is presented by Woolf within a distinctive fictional narrative framework and in highly poetic and abstract terms. The work can be described as a multi-plot coming-of-age story rendered via what I'll call a method of consciousness realism. It traces the lives of 6 characters, Rhoda, Susan, Louis, Neville, Jeannie and Bernard, from their early school days together and into adulthood, where psychological and existential connections between them are continued and maintained despite their physical and geographical separation. The Waves uses quantum physical ideas to describe consciousness and identity as processes. It combines the idea that all matter is made up of waves with the poetic metaphor of the sea wave, and uses this to dissolve the distinction between the identity of a character and other natural phenomena, and also the identities between characters. It establishes an undecidability of human and personal identity, and an indistinction between humans and other natural phenomena. Grammar and style are used to blur the distinction between speech and thought and between the consciousness and identities of the characters. The novel uses the present tense and abstract lyricism to give an effect of representing the experiences of the subjects immediately and subjectively in their present moment. Here is, for instance, the voice and perspective of the socially avoidant and existentially insecure Rhoda at a social event. "I shall edge behind them," said Rhoda, "as if I saw someone I know. But I know no one. I shall twitch the curtain and look at the moon. Draughts of oblivion shall quench my agitation. The door opens, the tiger leaps. The door opens, terror rushes in, terror upon terror, pursuing me. Let me visit furtively the treasures I've laid apart. Pools lie on the other side of the world, reflecting marble columns. The swallow dips her wing in dark pools. But here the door opens and people come. They come towards me, throwing faint smiles to mask their cruelty, their indifference. They seize me. The swallow dips her wings." The narration is mimetic here, in that it produces a form of psychological realism or consciousness realism. And this passage is representative of the general vacillation between speaking and thinking in the soliloquies by the 6 characters which The Waves is made up of, between the concrete and the abstract, between immediate experience and associations, and between prose and poetry. A thematic, narrative, and stylistic similarity in the characters' modes of expression and the repetitions of tropes across characters make their voices merge. The distinctions between the soliloquies dissolve as each is subsumed under and unified in the overall wave-like narrative motion of the novel in a form of oneness. The narration and repetitive structure thus reflect the central idea and intention of the work. Distinctions between human identities and minds and between humanity and nature are broken down, and the notion of a fixed and delimited self and a nucleus of consciousness is dissolved. From the novel arises one composite integrated mind. The characters themselves reflect explicitly on this experienced lack of boundaries amongst themselves and in relation to nature. Bernard insists on a uniting connection between subjects and a form of social singularity. I do not believe in separation. We are not single. Arriving in London with the train among all the other travellers, he observes, over us all broods a splendid unanimity. We are enlarged and solemnized and brushed into uniformity. Neville too notes this distinction between identities and observes as Bernard approaches him. I become not myself, but Neville mixed with somebody. With whom? With Bernard. Yes, it's Bernard. After finishing a game of tennis, Jenny feels her pulse beating and drumming in her body, and in her mind the border between her body and the universe is dissolved, expressed by way of metaphors of water in motion. There is nothing stayed, nothing settled in this universe, all is rippling, and as her physical excitement recedes, she thinks, now the tide sinks, the brisk waves that slap my ribs rock more gently. Susan, having returned to her childhood home after school in Switzerland, similarly conceives of herself as indistinguishable from the surroundings. At this hour, at this early hour, I think I am the field, I am the barn, I am the trees, I cannot be divided or kept apart. And as Lewis thinks of rippling fields of corn, he also conceives of himself in terms of nature. I should be transient, as the shadow on the meadow, soon fading, soon darkening and dying, there where it meets the wood, were it not that I coerce my brain to form in my forehead. I force myself to state, if only in one line of unwritten poetry, this moment. And he thus describes his state of being as a movement in the form of a sustained and continuous shifting between modes, and at the same time dissolving this concreteness of himself and the distinction between him and nature. Lewis indicates that it is language and the activity of thinking that prevent him from being and remaining in the transient and indistinct state. And this idea of language as formative of identity is central to the waves. Echoing Heisenberg's theory of observer determination, concreteness of identity come about by way of human observation and description, and the characters only take on definite form when seen and represented linguistically and conceptually by others. As Bernard speaks of Neville, he also creates him. Let me create you. You've done as much for me. You lie on this hot bank in this lovely, this fading, this still bright October day, watching boat after boat float through the combed out twigs of the willow tree. And you wish to be a poet, and you wish to be a lover. Bernard in turn remarks about Neville's observation of him. To be contracted by another person into a single being. How strange. And Bernard offers some opposition to this function, stating that I am more selves than Neville thinks. We are not as simple as our friends would have us to meet their needs. And he thus suggests that this concretization of the person is reductive and restrictive to a degree. The characters willingly merge with other persons and each other and non-human natural phenomena. They are inherently undecidable and they come to embody possibility in the novel. But the flow is stopped and the undecidability resolved when they find themselves observed in social situations and thereby fixated and reduced to a single identity. Rhoda thus observes about herself in this social situation, also quoted above. Like a ribbon of weed, I am flung far away every time the door opens. The wave breaks. I am the foam that sweeps and dills the uttermost rims of the rocks with whiteness. I am also a girl here in this room. The notions of selfhood and consciousness in the waves seem to some degree to align with a number of scientific and philosophical theories and ideas from the broad field of consciousness studies, such as the reductionist account of personal identity in philosophy represented, for instance, by Derek Parfit, the doctrine of no-self or non-duality in Buddhist theory and other contemplative theories, the panpsychist and also Buddhist view that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, the materialist explanations of consciousness and self and predictive processing theories of consciousness, the integrated information theory of consciousness, the ego dissolution experience in psychedelic states, and the potential for psychedelic human enhancement explored in recent research on psychedelics, the states of absorption, non-duality, tonic alertness, unpartitioned epistemic space described by Thomas Metzinger as minimal phenomenal experience, as well as the idea of the fundamental entanglement of the natural world represented, for instance, by Merlin Sheldrake, eco-theory, eco-criticism, and deep ecology, and the ideas of the ecological self and biocentric egalitarianism, represented, for instance, by Arne Næss and Timothy Morton. And if anyone has additions to these, I'd be very interested to hear. The waves present these ideas not in strict scientific discourse, but in lyrical terms, adding a poetic, aesthetic, as well as existential dimension, and making them experientially and emotionally relatable. By use of fictional and literary techniques, the waves draws the reader in, prompts the reader to not only critically reflect on its ideas, but to experience them. The novel shows that the adoption and acceptance of reductionist accounts of self and consciousness need not have an effect of estrangement or dehumanization, but that it in fact entails a possibility for existential emancipation and increased well-being and empathy, by offering the individual a way out of the existential claustrophobia of narrow, static and fixating concepts of identity and the restrictive and prejudiced views and identifications of one's personhood by others. The waves is thus connected to science and philosophy, both deliberately to specific scientific ideas in Woolf's contemporaneity, and implicitly to deeper and more perennial notions of and intuitions about self-consciousness and human existence. The novel illustrates how literature forms part of a larger cultural system of reciprocal influence and exchange of ideas. That literature is a sphere for exploration of scientific and philosophical ideas, an investigation of their possible practical, psychological, societal and existential implications. A space in which scientific research and theories are tested and developed through the use of narrative aesthetic metaphors, tried out within various philosophical, existential and ethical frameworks, and by application to a variety of human characters, and in the context of different possible social situations and cultural contexts. And Woolf's work, The Waves, illustrates the potential of literature and fictional narrative as such, for enabling humans to better and more deeply understand the possible ethical and existential implications of scientific progress, and for enhancing the human capacity for handling new moral questions, confusion and anxiety, and navigating the fundamental uncertainty of existence. Two typical and contrasting reactions and responses to the reductive and materialist explanation of consciousness and the new neurotechnological possibilities can be observed in the current research climate, and also, I think, in the broader public cultural sphere. One of embracement, existential relief, and emancipatory excitement, and another contrasting of resistance, moral confusion, worry, and existential dread. The wave obviously falls into the former category, dealing with the positive liberating effects. But to adequately respond to the new neuroscientific insights into consciousness and the emerging neuroanthropology, consciousness studies should acknowledge both these possible responses and also take into consideration the possibility of mental disturbance, existential dread, resignation and despair as people's basic assumptions about the nature of reality and themselves are being challenged and changed. The former intuition is linked to an anticipation that considerable enhancement of human well-being and morality will naturally follow from the rejection of the belief in a stable, centered and delimited self, and fixed notions of selfhood, the loosening of concepts of subjectivity and personal identity, as well as of free will, central agency and autonomy, and the doing away with the anthropocentric worldview. There's an expectation that this will lead to a reduction of individual psychological and existential suffering, and an expansion of the human capacity for empathy beyond its limited evolutionary function, and thus to a strengthening of the human identification with the fundamental interdependence between beings and the natural surroundings. Here, the acceptance of the reductionist neuroanthropology is expected to bring about an enhancement of human morality and to benefit human individuals, collectives and society at large, as well as other sentient beings and the environment as such. This potential for emancipation and human enhancement is also what Derek Parfit points to when he, in Reasons and Persons, argues that personal identity does not matter. Is the truth depressing? Some might find it so, but I find it liberating and consoling. When I believed that my existence was a further fact, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There's still a difference between my life and the lives of others, but the difference is less. Other people are closer. I am less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. Using the Perfidian reductive theory of personal identity and connecting it to the no-self doctrine, and especially Eastern philosophy, Danaher and Peterson more recently have pointed to the existentially liberating and socially beneficial potential of leaving behind individualism altogether and entering into a form of hive mind society. They argue that far from representing a scary and alien ideal, the hive mind society should be counted among the axiological possibilities for the future of humanity. There are reasons to think that aspects of the hive mind society are desirable. Pursuing it could enable stronger forms of intimacy, problem solving and goal achievement, moral enlightenment and moral behavior, while at the same time leaving open most of the traditional paths to finding meaning in life. The connection between altruism and ego dissolution also constitutes a central interest and expectation in contemporary psychedelic research, the results of which suggest that psychedelics hold a considerable potential for general human enhancement and for causing lasting positive changes in personality, a strengthened sense of meaningfulness, increased capacity for empathy, stronger identification with and investment in other people, other sentient beings, and nature. This seems to indicate that the fear of neurodisenchantment and moral and socio-cultural disruption is exaggerated, and that the reductionist neuroscientific explanation of human consciousness, self and identity may be compatible with existential frameworks and psychological self-conceptions that support and are conducive to well-being and moral behavior. This is also supported by the popularity of meditation, mindfulness, and the interest in psychedelics in contemporary culture, and that which suggests that the anti-essentialist explanation of the self, determinism, and anti-anthropocentrism do to some degree resonate positively in societies and the public. The other typical response to the reductionist neuroscientific explanations is predominant in neurophilosophy and neuroethics. Metzinger, for one, shows acute awareness of the problematic psychological, existential, and cultural effects, and he argues that just in technology assessment, where one tries to calculate potential dangers, unwanted side effects, and general future consequences of new technologies introduced in society, we need a new kind of anthropology assessment. We have to start thinking about the consequences a cultural implementation of a new image of man might have. Metzinger worries that the materialist views may lead to a demystification of humans' existence and our relations to each other. And he anticipates a risk of an increased division between those that cling to religion and the old anthropology and those groups who accept the new scientific consensus and materialist explanation of humans, as well as an increase in other forms of social and economic inequality. Flanagan and Caruso present these issues in terms of a third wave of existentialism, a neuroexistentialism, which is a reasoned expression of existential anxiety over the nature of persons. Neuroexistentialism, they say, is caused by the rise of the scientific authority of the human sciences and a resultant clash between the scientific and the humanistic image of persons. According to Flanagan and Caruso, the scientific view of contemporary neuroscience results in the same feeling of drift and anchorless search for meaning that is a hallmark of all existentialisms. They note that the materialist explanation is already influencing the imagination of the wider public with effects of destabilization of a Kierkegaardian kind. For most ordinary folk and many members of the non-scientific academy, the idea that humans are animal and that the mind is the brain is destabilizing and disenchanting, quite possibly nauseating, a source of dread, fear and trembling, sickness unto death even. With reference to David Chalmers' definition of the hard problem for consciousness, for empirical neuroscience, they present this existential challenge as a really hard problem, explaining it as the special problem for those of us living in the age of brain science, of making sense of the nature, meaning and purpose of our lives, given that we are material beings living in a material world. While such new forms of moral and existential confusion may be anxiety-provoking, humans have a capacity for coping with uncertainty. As Clark and Savulescu point out, new forms of moral uncertainty and confusion related to post- and transhumanism should and likely also will be confronted and are not valid reasons in themselves for avoiding technological progress or research into advanced forms of human enhancement. It could be argued that we have a demonstrated capacity to tolerate significant moral confusion, and the mere presence of another potential source of moral confusion should not be of any special concern to us. The creation of artificial intelligence, cyborgs, human brain organoids, human non-human chimeras, post-humans and uploaded minds all have the potential to cause new forms of moral confusion. It is possible that all human societies will collectively agree to avoid creating any of these sorts of beings and thereby avoid adding to our moral confusion, but this seems unlikely. It also seems unlikely that all of us would stick to such an agreement were we to make it. So it looks like we'll need to get better at either learning to tolerate or learning to resolve moral uncertainty and moral confusion. Indeed, this human capacity for dealing with uncertainty has been explored and thematized in literature for as long as narrative has existed, along with both the unpleasantness and the excitement and stimulation that uncertainty causes in life. Keats' famous term of negative capability in poetry and literature designates precisely this enhanced ability of some writers, such as Shakespeare, whom he emphasizes, to accept and remain in uncertainties, doubt and mystery, and is just one among many literary theoretical notions that deal with precisely these abilities in both writers and readers to accept and navigate uncertainty. From literary impressionism, new criticism, and through post-structuralism and deconstruction, literary theory in the late 19th and 20th century has been keenly interested in the effect and value of uncertainty of meaning, morality, and of existence as such, which I wrote my thesis on. Literature has been and remains a significant space in human culture for investigation of philosophical, anthropological, and scientific ideas and fundamental and new moral uncertainties. As such, literature has a crucial function in society in enabling people to understand new ethical challenges that arise with any scientific and technological progress, and deal with the general uncertainty and confusion of existence, and in experimenting with and developing existential and ethical strategies and frameworks for the present and the future in the face of these challenges. Literary works from the modernist period offer valuable philosophical insights and models of self and existence that can be used to strengthen the ethical and existential dimensions of modern neuroscience and consciousness research. Moreover, these works also illustrate the general potential of literature for having psychological traction and impact that is beyond the capacity of conventional philosophical and scientific discourse, and accordingly its potential for correcting public misconceptions and aligning folk intuitions with scientific and philosophical insights, while reducing any psychological disruption and anxiety, and even expanding the experience of existential meaning. The literary sphere is one in which common sense notions of morality, fundamental intuitions about existence, and popular cultural attitudes to and hopes and fears about the future of humanity interact with the newest scientific ideas and theories. And literature has much in common with philosophy and practical ethics. But literature also significantly differs from philosophy, for instance in that its narrative form and aesthetic aspects allow for more extensive experimentation with and application and trial of philosophical positions and ideas, and for a more multifaceted testing and exploration of the psychological, existential and socio-cultural implications of different moral positions. Literature makes possible a move from concept to practice, from ideas to experience, and it offers a deeper and more experiential way to engage with and more poetic modes of thinking about and relating to philosophy and science. As such, its inclusion together with philosophy and various other disciplines with strong existential and moral dimensions should be considered a highly valuable, if not necessary, attribution to the field of consciousness studies and ethics. I'm going to end with a slide which sort of goes to some of this value of literature as well, and which is formulated by Virginia Woolf's friend Goldsworthy Lois Dickinson, who wrote to her in response to The Waves to summarize what one of the main values of The Waves was, namely that it made clear how literature is not a kind of antithesis to science, but it's science made alive. Thank you.